When Silence Learned My Name. Chapter 1, The First Murmur. I don't remember exactly when it began. It must have been sometime in the early morning, when the sky still wore its velvet cloak and the world held its breath between yesterday and today. I was walking along the narrow path behind my home, where the moss grows thick and the air always smells of wet stone. The lantern I carried cast a gentle pool of light, just enough to keep my steps sure. Everything else was wrapped in a pleasant kind of quiet, as if sound itself were dozing. That's when I heard it. It wasn't a word, exactly, not in the way we speak words aloud. It was more like a gentle stirring at the edge of my awareness, a breath against the inside of my thoughts. A murmur without sound, yet I understood it all the same. It said, "I'm here." I paused and looked around, half expecting to see someone standing just behind me. But of course, there was no one. Only trees, mist, and my own shadow stretching behind me in the soft glow of the lantern. My shadow, which had always been quiet until now. I turned again, slowly this time, watching how the shadow moved. It bent and swayed as it always did, tied to my feet like a thread to a kite. But something had changed. There was an awareness in it, a softness around the edges, as if it were breathing. It didn't scare me. Instead, I felt a kind of hush fall over me, like being held in the palm of something gentle and very old. The way you might feel when stepping into a forgotten chapel, or pressing your cheek to the pages of a book that hasn't been opened in years. "I'm here," the shadow said again, though its lips never moved, because it had none. I didn't speak in return, not with my mouth. But somewhere deeper, a part of me nodded. "I know." And just like that, we began to walk together. In the days that followed, I found myself noticing little things. How my shadow lingered just a bit longer at corners, how it sometimes leaned when I remained still, how it felt warmer, strangely warmer, on my skin. It had always been a thing I carried, unnoticed, unremarkable. Now it was something else. A companion, perhaps. Or an echo that had learned to dream. The conversations we had were never loud. They never needed to be. It would whisper gently when I sat on the stone bench near the pond, when I poured tea into a second cup without thinking, or when I hummed melodies I didn't know I knew. Its voice was always just beneath sound, and always kind. Sometimes it would ask questions, though never with urgency. "Do you remember the first light you saw?" I didn't. But I tried to answer. "I think it was golden. Maybe through a curtain." My shadow would curl slightly, as if in thought. Other times, it simply narrated the world to me, like a poet whispering into a shell. "The trees are wearing yesterday's rain. There's a smile tucked under that cloud. The air is keeping a secret today." The most curious thing was how time softened around us. Moments stretched out like threads of honey, slow and sticky and sweet. I'd lose whole afternoons sitting on the wooden steps outside, watching the light shift across the grass, my shadow beside me like a quiet cat. No one else seemed to notice. Of course, there was no one else in the traditional sense. I hadn't seen another person in, well, I didn't count the days. My world had shrunk down to paths of stone and whispering leaves, and that was more than enough. The lantern stayed lit, even in daytime, and the sky never quite turned blue. It hovered somewhere between dawn and dusk, a gentle indigo that cradled everything. I often wondered if I was in a dream, or if dreams had wandered into me instead. But when I asked my shadow, it only replied. What difference would it make? We began to play little games, my shadow and I. Sometimes it would stretch longer than it should, reaching up walls or dancing across ceilings like light on water. Other times, it would split itself into smaller echoes, tracing my fingers or outlining stones in the garden. Why now? I asked it once. Why did you choose to speak to me? The answer came after a pause. Because you were quiet enough to hear. I liked that. It felt true. I had always been quiet, not out of sadness, but because silence had its own kind of music. And maybe, just maybe, that's what my shadow had been waiting for all along, not permission, but a pause. There were moments when I thought I might be dreaming too deeply. That I would wake with a start, tangled in blankets, the world loud and ordinary again. But the shadow always soothed that fear with a calm reply. You are not lost. You're exactly where you're meant to be. It never said where that was. And strangely, I never asked. Because in this world of soft colors and warm echoes, I didn't need to know. The path ahead wasn't lit by certainty, but by companionship. And that, I think, is a kind of light on its own. The first murmur was never repeated, not in the same way. But it became a rhythm, a presence, a new kind of gravity in my days. I didn't follow it, nor did it follow me. We moved together, always gently, always in step. I suppose that's what companionship really is, not noise, not command, but simply, presence. An agreement to share the quiet. As I write this now, the lantern's glow dances along the edge of the table. My shadow stretches toward me, not out of duty, but out of curiosity. It curls around my hand. And I smile. Because I know I am no longer alone, not in the way I used to understand the word. Chapter 2, The Garden with No Sun. There's a place I found, or perhaps it found me, not long after my shadow first spoke. It wasn't on any map, of course. Maps don't mark things like this. It was simply there, one day, at the edge of the woods beyond the stone steps. I hadn't seen it before, though I must have walked that way dozens of times. But there it was now, waiting quietly, like a room in a house I'd never noticed. A garden, though not quite like any garden I had known. No sun reached it, yet it was far from dark. The air shimmered with a gentle luminescence, like the inside of a pearl or the glow of fireflies in the hush of dusk. Pale flowers grew in careful spirals along soft moss paths, and every leaf looked like it was woven from memory. I stepped inside without hesitation. My shadow followed, curling beside me like a soft breeze. Here, time didn't seem to tick. It stretched and yawned and folded in on itself, wrapping the garden in a kind of peaceful stillness. Nothing moved with urgency. Even the petals, when they fell, seemed to float for minutes before reaching the ground. The first flower I touched hummed beneath my fingers, not a sound, exactly, but a feeling, like being remembered by something very old. This is yours, my shadow whispered. Mine? I asked, surprised. Yes. You made it. I didn't understand. I didn't remember planting a single seed or digging a single trench. Yet, the garden felt familiar in that way dreams often do, completely unknown, yet unmistakably yours. Not with hands, the shadow added, sensing my confusion. You made it with thoughts. With the parts of yourself you forgot you were still carrying. That made me pause. I walked a little farther, past the silver-laced pond where fish shimmered like drifting threads of silk. Past trees whose leaves whispered soft lullabies even without wind. Past a stone bench engraved with symbols I couldn't read but somehow understood. This place was not a memory, not exactly. It was made from the quiet moments that had passed through me unnoticed. The laughter I never voiced, the questions I never asked, the pauses between my own heartbeats. I didn't know thoughts could grow, I said. They all do, the shadow replied. Most just don't take root in places you can walk. There was one tree in the center of the garden that drew me in. Unlike the others, this one was tall and bare, its bark pale like the inside of a seashell, its branches delicate and twisting like fingers reaching into thought. It didn't bear fruit, nor flowers. Instead, its limbs held light. Tiny, floating orbs hovered just above each branch, soft and golden, but with a weight to them, as if they were holding something more than glow. Those are moments, said the shadow. Ones you almost forgot. I reached toward one, and it drifted closer of its own accord. Inside it, I saw myself sitting on a train I had once taken long ago. A younger version of me, gazing out the window as trees blurred past. There was no great event, no pivotal decision, just a quiet moment of wonder. A question forming in my eyes I never asked aloud. And then it was gone, the orb floating back to its place. I didn't feel loss. Only warmth. They're not meant to be held, said my shadow gently. Only noticed. Acknowledged. Like you, I murmured. There was a pause. And then the shadow seemed to smile, not visibly, of course, but I felt it somehow, in the space between us. Exactly like me. We sat beneath that memory tree for what felt like hours, though time, as always in this place, refused to behave. My back against the trunk, the moss soft and cool beneath me, my shadow curled around like a cat near a fire. It began telling me stories, soft ones, wordless ones. Feelings drawn from the corners of my chest and the folds of old thoughts. Images of old windows, gentle rains, worn notebooks, and the sound of distant chimes. And as it told them, the garden responded. New flowers bloomed where none had been. The light above shifted slightly, casting soft halos on the stones. A breeze carried the scent of forgotten summers. You are building, the shadow whispered. What am I building? A place for your quiet. That phrase stayed with me. A place for my quiet. Not a hiding place, not a cage, but a space where my stillness could live and breathe. A room where silence could stretch out and rest. A garden, woven not from seeds or soil, but from the gentle weight of being. As we explored deeper, I found a small archway made of ivy and stone. On the other side was a small grove, where the trees had no leaves and yet stood full of color. Their bark glowed faintly with hues I couldn't name, somewhere between violet and dusk, between breath and dream. This, my shadow explained, was the part of the garden that belonged to neither memory nor thought. It belongs to wonder, it said. And what grows here? Possibility. I watched a tree ripple with color as I simply looked at it. Another hummed when I imagined the sea. A third shimmered in response to nothing at all. Nothing, and everything. The grove didn't ask anything of me. It didn't require pruning or planting. It only wanted presence. And so I gave it. By the time I returned to the garden's entrance, it had changed again. Paths curved slightly differently, stones were in new places. Flowers had rearranged themselves in new spirals, new shades. "It's alive," I said aloud. "Yes," said the shadow. "Because you are." And I knew then, with a certainty as soft as wool, that I would return. That this place, this garden without sun, was not separate from me. It had always been here, waiting behind the noise. I placed my hand on the archway one last time before stepping back. The flowers hummed. The silence breathed. And my shadow curled beside me, whispering nothing but the comfort of being seen. Chapter 3, A Mirror Without Reflection. I wandered the garden until its spirals gave way to stone again. A narrow path, veiled in drifting mist, led me through a grove of sleeping trees. Their branches stretched upward like arms mid-embrace, unmoving, yet not lifeless. My shadow walked beside me, no longer behind as it once had been, but alongside me now, sometimes even just ahead, as though guiding rather than following. We didn't speak often. Silence had become our language, soft and complete. But even in silence, there was understanding. The path ended at a door. It stood alone, unattached to any wall or structure. A door without a house, a frame without hinges. And yet, it was perfectly upright, carved from pale wood veined with strands of silver. The handle was warm when I touched it, like a hand that had just let go. "Are you ready?" my shadow asked. "I don't know," I answered honestly. "That's enough." I turned the handle, and the door opened into darkness, not cold, not frightening, just absence. The kind of darkness you find behind your eyelids when you're not yet asleep, but no longer awake. I stepped through. The room beyond was silent in a way the garden was not. Where the garden hummed with memory and soft growing things, this space simply waited. The air was still. The light, if it could be called that, came from nowhere and everywhere at once, a soft, diffuse gray that left no shadows at all. My companion, the one I called Shadow, was no longer beside me. But I didn't feel alone. At the center of the room stood a mirror. It was tall, almost reaching the ceilingless heights above me. Its frame was made of stone, smooth as river-worn pebbles, and cool to the touch. But the glass, if that's what it was, reflected nothing. Not the room. Not the floor. Not me. I stepped closer, expecting to feel that flicker of disorientation that often comes when you stare into a mirror for too long. But there was none. There was only stillness. Then, from within the mirror, not on its surface, but deep inside, as though through layers of mist, I saw something move. Not an image. A shape. It wasn't me. And yet it was familiar. "I see it too," whispered my shadow, from somewhere behind me now. I didn't turn. I simply watched. The figure in the mirror didn't mimic me. It didn't copy my gestures or echo my thoughts. Instead, it moved gently, as though drifting underwater, brushing its fingers along unseen walls. It looked peaceful. Not happy, not sad. Just whole. "Who is that?" I asked. My shadow stepped beside me. I felt its presence more than saw it. "That's the you who never learned to forget." I didn't respond at first. "What did I forget?" I asked softly. There was a long pause. The way you used to believe in stillness. In wonder. In moments that didn't have to lead anywhere. My throat tightened. Not from sadness, there was no sharpness here, but from something deeper, something unspoken. She doesn't need to look back, my shadow continued. She carries nothing she doesn't choose to carry. I watched as the figure turned, not to face me, but to walk deeper into the fog within the mirror. As she did, the glass rippled like water. I raised a hand, unsure of what I meant to do. And the mirror let me in. It was like stepping into a thought I hadn't finished. There was no floor, but I didn't fall. No ceiling, but I felt held. The fog around me moved like fabric on a breeze, parting just enough to let me pass. The figure was waiting, sitting on the edge of something I couldn't see. When I drew near, she didn't look up. Just patted the space beside her. I sat. For a while, we said nothing. And then she began to hum, a tune I remembered from nowhere, but which felt as old as the word home. Why did you bring me here? I asked. She didn't answer in words. Instead, she reached into the space between us and offered something cupped in her palms. It was light. Soft, pulsing, like the glow of a firefly inside a drop of water. This, my shadow said softly, from behind again, is the part you left behind. I looked at it. I didn't take it. Not yet. What is it? A stillness that isn't emptiness. A silence that isn't loneliness. A place inside you that waits without asking. My hands trembled, not from fear, but from recognition. I reached out, and the light drifted into me like breath. And suddenly, I remembered. The moments I used to sit in the hallway, listening to rain on the roof. The way I traced patterns in dust just to feel how it moved. The long pauses before answering a question, not out of uncertainty, but because the space between words felt sacred. I had once loved stillness. Not as escape, but as existence. The figure in the mirror smiled, not with lips, but with presence. You are enough, she said, though her voice sounded like mine. I nodded. When I stepped back through the mirror, the room was brighter. Not with light, but with warmth. My shadow waited by the door, patient as always. Did you find her? It asked. Yes, I said. And? She's still here. Just quiet. My shadow didn't respond with words. Instead, it took my hand, not physically, but in that way it always had, with presence, and together, we stepped through the door. Back into the garden. Back into the path. But something had shifted. I was no longer simply walking beside my shadow. We were walking together as equals. Chapter 4, The Room of Quiet Things. The garden welcomed me back like an old friend. The air shimmered in that familiar, pearlescent way, and the mossy paths curled softly underfoot. Yet everything felt slightly different now, not changed exactly, but aware. As though the garden itself had noticed something within me had settled, like dust falling slowly through light. My shadow didn't speak for a while. It simply moved beside me, fluid and calm, as if it too were content to observe the new silence growing between us. We passed the lantern tree again, the one whose branches held forgotten moments. The glowing orbs hummed softly, but none drifted down this time. They watched, and that was enough. There's another place, my shadow said, at last. I know, I said. I can feel it. And I could. Beneath the surface of the garden, beneath the hush of leaves and the whisper of fog, I felt a pulse, slow, steady, deep. Like the heartbeat of something resting. It called without voice, pulled without force. We followed the rhythm. We came to a staircase of stone and soil, half swallowed by vines, leading downward into the earth. Each step glowed faintly as I pressed my foot to it, and the deeper we went, the more silent the world above became. Finally, we reached the door. It was small, carved into the side of a hill, and looked more like a forgotten cupboard than a place one could enter. But as I drew close, it opened, not outward or inward, but in its own quiet way, like mist dispersing in morning light. The room inside was neither large nor small. It was a perfect fit for stillness. There were no windows, yet the space glowed gently, as though the walls themselves remembered sunlight. Shelves lined the curved walls, each filled with objects that felt familiar without ever being named, a teacup without a handle, a book with no words, a ribbon that still held the warmth of someone's wrist. Each item rested without purpose. And yet, they radiated presence. "This is the room of quiet things," my shadow said. "What are they?" "Things you once loved, but never told anyone. Things you forgot you noticed." I stepped further in. A feather lay curled inside a glass bowl. I picked it up, and remembered sitting on a porch somewhere, watching a bird molt in silence. No one had spoken. No one had noticed the moment but me. On another shelf was a smooth stone, warm to the touch. I pressed it to my cheek and remembered holding my grandmother's hand as we crossed a bridge that no longer exists. There were dozens, hundreds, of such quiet things. Each holding a hush, a moment, a breath I had once carried and then misplaced. In the center of the room stood a chair. It wasn't ornate, but it had weight, not physical, but emotional. The kind of weight that anchors you, gently. "Sit," my shadow said. So I did. And then, the silence deepened, not into emptiness, but into presence. It was as though the room had been waiting all this time not to be filled, but to be noticed. Around me, the quiet things began to shimmer softly. The ribbon curled. The book opened to blank pages that glowed. The feather danced slightly in the still air. And in that stillness, I heard them, not with ears, but with understanding. They weren't speaking in language, but in memory. In essence. Each object told me a story I had never put into words. The joy of feeling warm light through closed eyelids. The comfort of hearing rain on rooftops while curled beneath a heavy blanket. The peace in folding a letter you never sent but needed to write. The sound of your own heartbeat in a room with no ticking clock. None of these stories needed to be told aloud. They simply asked to be remembered. My shadow stood near the door, not intruding. Waiting. I turned to it. "Why do we forget these things?" The shadow tilted its head, not in judgment, but in reflection. "Because the world is loud," it said. "And you learn to match its volume." That truth sat gently in my chest. "But you were quiet," the shadow added. "Even when you didn't know it." I smiled. There was something deeply affirming in that, not praise, not correction. Just observation. Just recognition. In the stillness of that moment, I realized something. "I'm not afraid of forgetting," I said. The shadow looked at me. I'm afraid of not remembering. A pause. Then don't rush, it whispered. The quiet will hold what you can't. Before we left, I knelt beside one of the shelves and reached for a small jar sealed with wax. I didn't know why, but it drew me in. When I opened it, a scent spilled into the air, clean, soft, like linen warmed by the sun. And just like that, I was sitting in a childhood room, wrapping myself in freshly washed sheets that smelled like home. No words. No drama. Just warmth. I closed the jar again, eyes damp with something that wasn't sorrow. This room will wait for you, said the shadow. Whenever you need it. I nodded. We stepped back through the door, up the stone stairs, into the world above. And though I carried nothing in my hands, I held something new within me. A deeper stillness. A gentler kind of presence. And the quiet things I had once thought I'd lost, breathing softly beside my heart. Chapter 5, The Echoing Path. There's a path that doesn't begin, not in the usual way. You don't find it by looking. It appears only when you're already walking, when your thoughts have softened, and your footsteps have become less about direction, and more about rhythm. It appears like a ripple in still water, inviting you in without requiring you to arrive anywhere. That was how I found the echoing path. My shadow and I had been walking through the garden, just beyond the tall grasses that swayed in wind I couldn't feel. The light was growing dimmer, not from any setting sun, but as if the air itself were slowly remembering twilight. And then, quite naturally, the moss under my feet turned to stone. The garden dissolved into mist. The sky overhead vanished into indigo silence. And the echoes began. They didn't frighten me. They were too gentle, too familiar. It wasn't noise, it was the memory of sound. Laughter. The rustle of pages. The sound of my own name said softly, long ago. Each sound brushed past me like wind passing through tall reeds, never pulling, never insisting. Just present. Just real. My shadow, now fully beside me, didn't speak. It merely listened. As did I. The path was made of stone, smooth and uneven in equal measure, as though laid by hands that valued feeling over symmetry. On either side, tall walls of shifting mist rose high, but never confined. They were more like curtains than walls, shimmering with echoes. I paused once, as a voice hummed near my ear. It was a lullaby I hadn't heard since I was small. I didn't try to follow it. I simply let it pass through me. That's the way, said my shadow, its voice soft as breath. This place. I began, it feels like a memory I haven't had yet. Because it is, the shadow said. Here, you walk through what your heart has remembered, even when your mind has forgotten. We passed a lantern hanging in mid-air, unhooked from anything but softly glowing all the same. Inside its glass shimmered a moment. Me, standing at a train station, watching raindrops chase one another down the window. Another lantern floated ahead, showing me in a library, fingers brushing along the spines of books I didn't read, but somehow understood. Each one held no drama. No climax. Only quiet presence. You've walked through your life like this, said the shadow. Noticing the things others passed by. I used to think that made me different, I whispered. It did, said the shadow, gently. But not alone. As we walked deeper, the echoes changed. They became more personal. Closer. The sound of my breath when I used to cry silently in bed, not from sadness, but from the deep ache of being unseen. The creak of a chair I used to sit in, long after everyone had left the room. The hush of a forest I once walked through, thinking no one knew where I was, and liking that. All these sounds echoed, not loudly, not accusingly, but as if to say, "You were here. You mattered, even then." And my shadow whispered, "You don't need to explain yourself to the quiet. It already knows you." There was a bend in the path, a soft curve that led into a hollow framed by light. No walls, no doors. Just openness. And there, I saw myself, not as a child, nor an adult, but something in between. A version of me still forming, still soft around the edges. This self sat cross-legged on the stone, looking up at nothing in particular. When I stepped closer, it turned. The face smiled, not a greeting, but recognition. "I used to talk to you," I said. The figure nodded. "And I always listened." I knelt beside them, and together we watched the mist swirl in patterns that meant nothing and everything. Shapes formed and disappeared, like thoughts not yet spoken. "Did you ever answer?" I asked. "Every time," they said. "But you were still learning to hear." We sat for a while, in shared quiet. Not asking questions. Not solving anything. Just remembering that we'd never truly been apart. Eventually, I rose, and the younger self faded into mist. But something of them stayed with me, something curious and soft, like the feel of morning air against skin that's just begun to wake. The path ahead had narrowed. Not in a confining way, but in the way of focus. Like a single brushstroke on paper. The echoes grew softer, further apart, until even the quiet had a rhythm. My shadow reached out, not with a hand, but with presence. And I understood, we were almost there. Not at an end. But at a beginning that curved inward. Just before the path ended, there was one final lantern. It was smaller than the others, nearly hidden among soft stones. Inside, no image flickered. Just a soft pulse. A quiet waiting. "What's inside?" I asked. My shadow paused. "That one hasn't happened yet." "Is it mine?" "It will be. When you're ready." I watched the lantern for a while. I didn't open it. I didn't rush it. Instead, I bowed my head gently, in the way people sometimes do when they don't have words for what they feel. And I walked on. As the path faded beneath my feet, I stepped back into the garden once more. But the garden had changed. Or perhaps I had. The echoes remained behind me, like soft footprints in water, vanishing, but never truly gone. I turned to my shadow. "Do you think the lantern will still be there, when I come back?" "It always was," said the shadow. And we walked on. Chapter 6, When Light Bows to Shadow. It began the way soft things often do, not with a shift, but with a settling. There was no great change in the world around me, no final signpost or closing of doors. Only a quiet deepening. A sense that the air itself had taken a long, gentle breath and was now holding it. As if the whole world waited to exhale with me. I found myself in the clearing again, though it looked nothing like before. The garden, the mist, the stone paths, they had all softened into something more dream than place. There were shapes, yes, and light and sound, but they moved in slow ripples, as if everything was gently remembering how to be. My shadow stood with me. But I could feel it was no longer just beside me. It was within me. Not as possession, not as dominance, but as presence. As recognition. Are we finished? I asked. The shadow didn't answer, not with words. Instead, it moved with me, like breath moves with the chest, like thought moves with silence. I felt it settle along my spine, across my shoulders, into the curve of my palms. Not heavy. Not foreign. Familiar. I'm not afraid anymore, I said aloud. Still, no reply. Only a soft warmth blooming inside my chest, as if the garden itself agreed. I began to walk. There was no path now, only intention. And yet, the world unfolded under each footstep like a book whose pages turned by presence alone. The trees bowed slightly as I passed, not in reverence, but in recognition. The mist curled around me like a cat, purring with the scent of memory. Even the air shimmered with a gentler light, as if dusk had decided to stay just a little longer, for me. In the distance, a light appeared. Not a lantern. Not the sun dot. Something else. It glowed with no source, and yet it pulled at me with kindness, like a friend beckoning from across a familiar room. I followed it. At the center of everything, though I couldn't have said where everything was, I found a pool. It was shallow, round, perfectly still. The surface didn't reflect my image. It reflected everything else. The garden. The mist. The memories I had wandered through. The lanterns. The echoes. The room of quiet things. The girl in the mirror. The voice in the stone. And beside all of them, me. Not as I was now. Not as I had been. But as I truly am. Whole dot. Soft dot. Seen. I knelt at the edge of the pool, unsure whether I wanted to touch it. And then, I felt it. The shadow, my shadow, leaning forward with me. Not apart. Not separate. One. Together, we reached toward the water. And the moment our fingertips touched the surface, the light folded inward. It wasn't a flash. It was a warmth. Like dusk settling on your skin after a long day. Like the inside of a song you've forgotten you love. Like the shape of a sigh that needed no reason. I felt myself dissolve, not disappear, but expand. Not end, but arrive. There was no fear. Only fullness. Only stillness. Only presence. I saw myself again, walking the stone paths, listening to the echoes, gathering the quiet things I'd once forgotten. I saw the mirror, and the girl who waited. I saw the small jar sealed with scent, the ribbon that remembered warmth, the lanterns pulsing like soft heartbeats. And in every moment, I was there. I had always been there. I had never been alone. When the light dimmed, if dim was even the word, I was standing in the garden once more. Only now, there were no boundaries. No edges dot. No entrances dot. No exits. Everything flowed gently into everything else. The trees into the sky. The sky into the mist. The mist into my skin. And my shadow? Still there. But no longer something behind me. It was me. The part of me I had not spoken aloud. The part one had kept tucked in the hush of silent days. The soft voice that knew how to wait. The echo that never needed to be heard to be real. I sat down on a patch of moss. I didn't know where I was. But I knew I had arrived. There was no celebration. No crescendo. Only a feeling. Like light bowing to shadow. Like knowing, without needing to understand. And I realized something then, with clarity that felt like warmth on the back of my neck. Peace is not something you seek. It's something that notices when you finally stop reaching. And it comes to sit beside you. Quietly. Like a shadow. Like a friend. Like a part of you that was always there, just waiting for the light to soften enough to see it clearly. So here I remain, not lost, not found. Just here. Still. Listening. Whole. And my shadow sits beside me. No longer waiting to speak. Just being.